You're listening to Salford City Radio, 94.4 FM, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you all the news in sport from the local area and around the world. And we've had our latest segment where we talk to some of the most leading people in the field of psychology and related fields who've been really fascinating and give us an insight into what they do, their research, just generally talk about their perception and their ideas in the field of psychology and mental health and related areas. We interview some of the world's best sports people, athletes, and today we have a really fascinating guest. He's an international speaker, fantastic speaker, an award-winning speaker, but he's not on the show today to talk about his speaking. He's on the show to talk about interviewing, an area that he specialises in. He's writing a new book. He's been on the show before. Fantastic, really interesting guest. He's spent so much time and effort researching to put this book out there, and it's so relevant to the world we live in today because obviously there's been challenging times and people unfortunately have been made redundant and obviously circumstances beyond anyone's control. It's been a very challenging time for a lot of people, and no doubt people will be looking to get back into work again, and he's going to give us some insights in terms of what can give us the best chance of getting a job, because it's not easy. We know there's a lot of things involved in getting a job, but at least one thing we can do is look at one variable to stand the best chance we can in an interview. So Chris Delaney, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
We just say, Jimmy, that is one of the best intros I've ever had in my life. Like, really made me sound amazing, so I really appreciate that, and I hope the advice I'm going to share today will help your listeners as well.
Yeah, no, I think that, very modest, Chris. I think, you obviously, your stuff, and you're a great speaker. That's for sure, and I think that's certainly something that we should get you on the show again in a separate topic. But today you're going to talk about interviewing, and I've spoken to you about interviewing before, and a lot of what you say makes sense. But now I think what you do, which is quite unique, and for our listeners to listen in, it's not just regurgitating what's out there. You've sort of really spent a lot of time to think about this and sort of give us an insight into what we can do to stand the best chance. So, Chris, give us an idea of the latest book you've got now and what it involves.
So I basically created the interview prediction grid model, which allows people who are applying for job interviews to work out how they'll be perceived by the job interviewer, deciding if they're going to be successful or unsuccessful. And it's kind of like a different couple of levels, this, because there's an unconscious bias. It's how you perceive in terms of your knowledge and experience versus your level of confidence, which creates an interview identity. So the whole model, which is at the moment is free on the website and will be a book in the future, is helping people to decide how successful they'll be in a job interview based on how they're perceived.
That's really interesting stuff, and I think based on what you said there, people who interview, the people who do the interview would get a lot out of the book as well. Before we sort of go on and talk about how we could use it from the point of view of going for an interview, do you think, Chris, it's useful for the actual interviewer themselves to understand about this themselves? Because, I mean, there is obviously unconscious bias, and I mean, I can fully appreciate competence discrimination where, for example, Chris may be more experienced speaker than me, or you might be more competent or vice versa at a certain task, and the person who's got more competence and more suitable to the role gets the job. But these unconscious biases, they're real, they're out there, we all have them, all our listeners, we've all got them through various mechanisms, but being aware of them can be quite useful, would you say, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. Like, the first part of the book is all about unconscious bias and the psychology of perception. And as an interview, you need to know that. And a lot of HR companies, large organisations and businesses are putting their HR teams through unconscious bias training. So as an example, if people are unaware what unconscious bias means, is an interviewer can walk downstairs to invite you to the interview room, and based on, as an example, your age, your nationality, your sex, the clothes that you're wearing, or how you speak, or even how you shake your hand, all creates this millisecond perception about you. So as soon as they see you or hear you, they make an opinion about how competent you're going to be for the job you're applying for. And even worse than that, or positively for some people, is when someone reads your application form, if they perceive you're going to be a strong candidate, that creates a halo effect, which then influences how they interview you in the interview.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. And I think for our listeners, in terms of unconscious bias, so we've got these people have got these sort of stereotypes, and for the most part, they can be unintentional, can't they, Chris? People, they're not really aware of it, and it's not like they're going out there intentionally. It's just so unconsciously unconscious. It's difficult to eliminate that. Is that sort of a fair assumption as well? It's like so unconscious.
Well, and that's why there's three responses basically. So you are aware and don't care. So that means you meet someone who's a certain age or a certain nationality or a certain sex, and you make a judgment about them. So you say females shouldn't be applying for traditional masculine roles. You're aware of that stereotype, but you don't care. So it's very hard for the applicant to change that interviewer's opinion. So these are your sexist, your ageist, your racist interviewers. The second one is aware and care. So because of your culture you've been brought up in, or the environment you've been brought up in, this unconscious bias, this thought, this prejudice pops into your mind. You recognise it and think, I'm not going to let that affect my judgment of the applicant. So that's aware and care. Or you get some people who aren't aware because the stimulus that creates that unconscious bias doesn't affect them. So they're not racist, or they're not sexist, or they're not ageist, as an example. So they're not aware of it, and they often have a fair job interview process for their applicants.
That's really powerful stuff. And I mean, sort of look at unconscious biases, and so there are organisations now who do training on unconscious biases, and that in itself has been controversial in the sense that at least some people I've spoken to in the field of psychology question the reliability of such training to remove them, and the efficacy, but also in saying that it insinuates that one has a bias anyway. So you might not have the bias, Chris, but then you go on this training and then you start sort of questioning, do I have this bias? So the effectiveness, but that's, I guess, another story for another day, but that makes it all the more important for me to be aware of what you're talking about if you're going for a job. That's why I think it's really powerful to know about this. Is that a fair assumption, do you think, Chris?
Well, they say, don't they, that trainee doctors end up thinking they've got all the diseases that they're learning about because you're not aware of the diseases. You start reading about it and you start thinking, oh, that sounds a little bit like me, so you make it kind of relevant to your knowledge and your experience.
Yes.
I was going down Brown the other day as well, and it did this, it was an old clip actually, but he basically got this marketing team and asked them to come to this venue to create a poster for this new product he was launching. And he picked them up in a taxi and they drove around London and ended up being in this building where he explained the concept and they had to come up with these different posters. And at the end, Darren Brown unveiled the poster he drew, which was exactly the same as the picture that these two marketing guys had drawn. And it was like, wow, how did you do that? Then they re-showed the taxi journey, and in the taxi journey from their marketing office to this venue in London, they drive past all these things, and hidden just on the street corners and shop windows were all these different symbols and different pictures, which is the artwork that they created. So not even being aware that they noticed all these different stimuli throughout this 15-minute car journey made them draw this exact picture that Darren Brown wanted them to draw.
Wow.
And it's all about seeding. If you say to someone, are less likely to be good at masculine jobs, they might not believe that, but that thought can be a seed, an idea in the back of their brain, which potentially could influence the way they score the applicant on the job interview.
Yes, that's really interesting stuff that you say, and that sort of shows that sort of priming that goes on. I suppose my question would be, let's look at this scenario, Chris, where you're going in for a job interview, and say, for example, a clear example. So I remember reading a research article a long time ago where the lecturer turned up wearing a suit and had more credibility than when they didn't wear the suit. Now, obviously, that's would be applicable to maybe, the sort of job where you would wear a suit. I'm sure the same sort of thing would be appropriate if, in a mechanic class or whatever class is viable. So, but things like attire, what we wear, is something we control over. I mean, I can sort of wear what's most appropriate to that environment, but certain things I can't change is obviously, well, there's many factors I can't. I can't change about myself. Obviously, my ethnicity and so on and so forth. So, going into a situation, Chris, what can we do to give ourselves the best possible chance. Tell us more about some of the insights that you've sort of had for your research.
So what happens is you meet an applicant and you have an unconscious bias that makes that initial opinion about that person. I like him or I don't like him on a very simple basis. Yeah. And in real life, all the decisions about that person are filtered through this funnel of I like that person or I don't like him because of the unconscious bias. Because in real life, we're not analysing the situation. We meet someone, make an opinion, and then, we make our opinions based on that. In the job interview, though, it's a very analytical process. So what research shows is that unstructured job interviews, where you have an informal conversation, people make decisions at the emotional level. I like this person or I don't like this person. But the research also shows is that if the interview uses a structured job interview, where you ask the same 10 questions using the same format in the same order to each applicant, and then score their answers on a scoring criteria based on the job criteria they mention in their answer, you're more likely to predict that applicant's job performance. But that's the analytical process. So you listen to what the applicant's saying, you have a list of things that you need them to know or do in that job, and you put those two things together. So because most job interviews these days use a structured job interview, this analytical process, you can change your employer's initial opinion about you based on your perceived level of knowledge and experience versus your level of confidence, which in the book writing creates 16 different interview identities.
Yes, yeah, that's really powerful stuff. I mean, I'll give you a situation, Chris, years ago. It'd be interesting what you make of this. This is like we're talking like well over 20-something years ago now, if not even more. And I was in a situation where I sort of applied for some work to do some coaching out in some football coaching out in the States, and I sent the application form in. And when I went into the interview, the guys said to me that they were expecting someone, I don't know if it was a good or a bad thing, but they were expecting someone completely different based on my name and so on and so forth. And we got on and so on and so forth. I mean, would you say that sort of illustrates unconscious biases, Chris? Even before I walked through the door, just sending an application form in that already formed an opinion going forward. That was before the days of Google as well, by the way, before the internet and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's so funny. There's a really famous research paper. It's called something like Mo versus Mohammed. And it's about unconscious bias based on people's name. So the same application form was sent out, and one of them on the application form, the name was just Mo, and the other name was Mohammed. So Mo is just short for Mohammed. And for the application forms that they sent to hundreds of different organisations with the name Mo in it, Mo got more job interview invitations compared to the application forms that had Mohammed on it.
Wow. Yes, that's and that's. So it shows even before.
There was another experiment based on people's weight. So the same application form went out to thousands of different employers, but this time he attached a photograph to it. The photograph was either a picture of an obese person or a picture of an average weight person. And what happened from the results from that is that if you was obese, you seemed to be more lazy than an average weight person. So the average weight person received more job offers. So when I did research, I was thinking, is that still true? Because in the last couple of years, we've become really aware of unconscious bias, equal opportunities, more aware like mental health as well, and supporting people. And sometimes people are overweight because of their mental health, and all these different factors that we're now more supported of. So I put on some social media channels this research, and some people who are currently interviewing applicants still said on this live social media stream that they would not recruit an overweight person because they would perceive them to be lazy.
Wow. That's really interesting stuff. I mean, and the reason being, like you said, Chris, I think that's really important to make that point. And certainly if there's anyone doing interviews, I mean, people do struggle with weight for various reasons. It could be a medical condition. It could be, obviously, like you said, mental health, emotional eating. It could be variable factors, really. And I mean, to equate laziness with being a beast when there's so many factors that are involved in there, and so much awareness, and these days it's really fascinating that people would do that, and but obviously that's the feedback you've got, and I think if there's certainly people who are interviewing out there listening, it's really important that they're sort of aware of their own in that respect. But so, I mean, obviously, if someone is sort of carrying weight, Chris, if they have been struggling, I mean, what do they do? Do they sort of they go in for a job interview? Do they sort of what should one do in these sort of situations? What can any of us do if we're faced with a situation where we can't change a variable, at least in that given time? What can we do?
Yeah, like you said, and the variables, like you're saying, Jimmy, stuff like it could be being obese, it could be being attractive as well, which can sometimes be a negative depending on the job you're applying for. So attractive people are more likely to gain employment for low-skilled jobs rather than high-skilled jobs, because high-skilled jobs, the interviewer is more looking for your skills, qualities, and attributes. Attractive people applying for the opposite sex job, so an attractive female applying for a traditional masculine role is more unlikely to receive the job offer than an ugly female applying for a traditional masculine role. So there's all these different biases going on, but what you need to remember is that's unconscious, and that bias creates an opinion in the first milliseconds of meeting the applicant.
I suppose, no, I mean, that's really interesting stuff. And I suppose with that, Chris, in terms of attractiveness, it's like, how does one define attractive? Obviously, in the eyes of corporation, and we're consistently told how we should look and shouldn't look. But I suppose culturally too, I mean, what might be beautiful in one culture might not be in another culture, and so on and so forth. But obviously, I take your point, and the point being is that however one defines attractiveness, that might have an impact or an implication on the role that they're going for. Going forward. But let's say if someone does find themselves in a situation where they're in an environment that regards them as not being as attractive, or not being as sort of suitable, is there realistically anything they can do, Chris? Is their mind made up before we walk through the door? You mentioned the sort of different stages there. Is their mind already made up before we've got a chance to sort of speak and put our case forward?
So it's only made up from the employer's perspective if they are a sexist, racist, ageist, or whatever it is they are. So if they hate overweight people, or they hate a certain age category, or whatever it is, then the mind's made up, and it's really hard to change it. But hopefully, and realistically, from the research I read, most people are willing to have their mind changed, because this is an unconscious opinion they're making.
Yes.
In the job interview, it would be an analytical process, not an emotional process of structured job interviews. You have a small window to change that opinion. So in the first two questions in the job interview, you can showcase your level of knowledge and experience versus your level of confidence, and that will create a new filter, a new funnel that the interviewer will make their opinions about you on. So if they see you as being highly competent and highly confident, you'll have a strong interview identity, so all forthcoming job interview answers will be filtered through this strong interview identity. Where they perceive you to have a low level of knowledge and you've got a low confidence level, and they create a negative interview identity about you, all your answers will be filtered through this negative interview funnel.
Wow, so you got to hit the ground running when you go in there, and that sort of resonates. I went into an interview years ago, and I suppose sort of what you mentioned there, Chris, I didn't tick the boxes in terms of, I think on variable factors where the unconscious biases were concerned, but where I did was certainly the knowledge base. I just hit them from the off with what I knew about that area. And is that sort of similar to what you're saying there, or have I got it wrong?
No, that's completely right. So basically, the interview is to test the applicant's job performance. The interview is trying to predict how well you do the job if I employ you. And if they need you to be a weak candidate, you're going to be scored weakly. Yes. You need to be very strong, because you hit them from the off. You're like, I know about these skills, I know about these qualities, I got experience about doing this, I can problem solve, I've got these, I can do all this stuff, and I'm very confident in my own self-worth, my own ability. They're going to think this person is hireable, this person, if I employ him, will work well for my team. So apart from the people with sexist, racist and ageist, most interviewers are open for their mind to be changed. The interview process is to help people relax so they can show the best version of themselves.
Wow.
You only have a short window. You only have 6 to 10 questions, and the interview will make an opinion about your interview identity often within the first 2 questions. So the first 2 questions, the interview will like you, and then they'll mark you a little bit higher for all the forthcoming job interview answers.
So then they sort of start to focus on your competence level, your ability, inadvertent to the other sort of biases that they might have. Am I correct in saying that, Chris? Is that the sort of key going forward? So they sort of, yeah, that's it. So as an example, we'll use the interview thinks women shouldn't be hired for traditional male roles. So they meet a female with this unconscious bias, but then the female applicant starts expressing her skill set, her experience, her knowledge, what she can bring to the team, and he was like, wow, this person's got a high level of knowledge and experience. And because the female is presenting this in a confident manner with confident communication, he was like, she's confident, she's got this skill and knowledge base. Together, that's a powerful combination. So if I hire this person, they're going to be a really good asset for the organisation and for the team. And so, do you prepare for that before you go into the interview, Chris? Is it, is that sort of what you suggest, that we sort of, have a sort of think about how we're going to showcase our skills? Is that something you prepare with your clients? I know time is sort of short and it's not easy to explain in the short time we've got, but is that the sort of gist of it, where you sit down and really carefully plan about how you're going to go in and hit the ground running?
So it's really hard to predict how you'll perceive. So step one is to understand how an employer is going to perceive you. So why start with the interview prediction grid, where basically there's 2 sets of questions, one for knowledge and experience, and one for your perceived level of confidence. And you can answer these questions. The ones that you have, what level of qualification do you have, or how many years experience, do you present well, do you have strong self-worth, do you have a good communication style? And by answering these 2 sets of questions that take 30 seconds, you can then predict your job interview identity, which tells you how an employer is going to perceive you in that job interview. Once you have the knowledge of how you're perceived, you can then make the tweaks and changes to present yourself in a better way to be more employable and more hireable.
That's powerful stuff. And and sort of beyond that, Chris, what do you sort of do? I mean, sort of, let's say, for example, you get a call from your client a night before the interview, and you've done, you've got as far as that, and they might have some sort of doubts in their mind. Is there anything else that you can do to help them stand the best chance going forward?
Yep, so the research shows that if you've got a low level of confidence, you're more likely to self-disclose weaknesses when you're unprompted. So if you've got low levels of confidence, low self-worth, during your interview, you'll tell people all your errors, all your mistakes, and all your weaknesses. Where high-confidence individuals won't do that. What they will do is talk about their strengths, their skill base, and what they can bring to the team. Low-confidence applicants as well will monitor the interviewer's behaviour, and if they think the interviewer is being a cold interviewer, they'll blame that on their own interview style. High-confident people don't do that. They don't care what the interviewer is doing. They focus internally on what they can bring to the team. So changing your perspective on how you conduct yourself in that job interview changes your level of confidence.
That's really interesting stuff, Chris. That's a massive takeaway in terms of, I think, for sure, I've certainly taken something away from that. I'm sure our listeners have. So you go in there and you focus on your skills and what you bring to the party or to the team, in your words, and that's a good thing, Chris. Do you think sort of going in there, sort of writing your skills down and sort of being congruent about your skills and sort of telling the interviewer, this is what I bring to the table, rather than sort of deflecting and sort of focusing on the weaknesses that we all have, to be fair? Is that a key message, do you think?
Yeah, perfectly. When you ask that question tell us about a mistake that you've made, what low confident people do is talk about the mistake, but also talk about how different people supported that mistake, or the environment wasn't that environment to be successful. Where what high confident people do is talk about what they learned from any errors or mistakes.
Fascinating, that, Chris. It just something resonated there when I did have this sort of interview a while ago I won't mention what it was for, but basically it almost echoes what you're saying there, and it's brought some understanding. I ended up getting the gig in the end for the work that I'd sort of pitched for, but it was really interesting that you mentioned then when I did talk about Wheaton, I did say, well, they were learning experiences. That's what I've got to where I am now in terms of my skill set. Powerful stuff, and so going forward, Chris, it's been really fascinating, and we could speak for the next few hours on this, no doubt. But we don't have that long on the show. Is there any way people can get in touch? You mentioned some free resources there, or things they can download, or maybe they want to email you about exploring a little bit more. What's detail, Chris, have you got to give our listeners?
Yeah, so if anyone wants to take the interview prediction grid test, which shows your interview identity, so you'll be one of 16 different interview identities, and that shows you how the interview will perceive you. Mm-hmm. That's a complete free test. It takes about 30 seconds to complete, and then you can read the description about yourself. And that's on employmentking.co.uk/IPG. So interview prediction grid IPG.
Yeah, I'm going to give that a shot myself, Chris, and it'll be interesting stuff. So just to sort of reiterate, Chris, that's that website again, just to sort of get it out there. So it's Employment King, did you say?
employmentking.co.uk/IPG.
Fantastic, and they and the listeners can take the test and see how they're perceived.
Yeah, that's it. The test takes 30 seconds, and then once you identify which interview identity you are, below the test is drop-down boxes for each of the 16 identities, and it gives you an overview. We're going to add on in the next week or two a section on your strengths and areas of development. So we're continuously doing research on this and then adding to these interview identities. So yeah, it gives you a real good insight how you're perceived, gives you tips about what you need to do to change that perception to make it more positive, which will basically all result in you getting more job offers.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds really, really interesting stuff. I mean, sometimes we perceive ourselves in one way, and it's not until we sort of, ask around, but it can only be a good thing, obviously, to give ourselves the best possible chance, and then obviously once we understand how we are perceived, we can sort of action to give ourselves the best chance to succeed going forward, and there are techniques moving forward, Chris, to sort of work to our strengths.
Yeah, definitely. Stuff like, as an example, people who have like a high level of knowledge and experience, one of the things they do naturally is use like industry acronyms, industry jargon, they quote models and theories related to the sector they're working in, which creates this generalization that this person is highly competent because this natural language flows out during the job interview. When you've got low levels of knowledge and experience, you don't really talk about that. You talk about experiences that are relevant to the job you're applying for.
No, absolutely, that's really interesting stuff. So, Chris, it's been really fascinating having you on the show. I know that our listeners have really enjoyed and took a lot out of what you've talked about. That was Chris Delaney, a fantastic speaker, award-winning speaker. He's an expert in helping people prepare for job interviews and other areas, no doubt, as well. His latest. But when's the book going to be out, Chris? Have you got a rough idea when the book will be out?
It's just going through the editing process,
yes.
So probably another 6 to 12 months, and then it'll be out. But like I said, on the website, we're constantly updating the research, the research papers, links to the test. So for now, people can get lots of information from there.
We'll keep an eye on the book as well, and that's great stuff. So thanks for being on the show. That was Chris Delaney. Very kind of him to join us on the show to give us an insight into his new model that works around giving ourselves the best chance of succeeding in an interview, which is highly relevant in the situation we're in at the moment. So, Chris, thanks for being on the show. Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. So you're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show with Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very privileged on this show to bring you some of the world's best athletes, sports people across a broad range of different sports. We also bring you coaches, trainers, different roles in sport as well. And our latest segment that's been running for a couple of months now, so it's just been running for a little bit now, is bringing you some of the world's leading people in the field of psychology and related fields who talk about mental health and their own research and all topics related to psychology. Today we have an interesting guest who is the head of commercial for British Fencing. He's going to tell us about the state of fencing in 2020 in GB, and I think it's really interesting, and I think it's an interesting sport. I certainly watch it when the Olympics are on, and I'll be honest and open to admit that during the year I don't really get too much involved or see too much of it, but hopefully today our guest will tell us a little bit more about the sport itself. So, James Craig, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you very much for having me, Jimmy. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, great to have you on board, James. One of the aims of this show is to increase participation and awareness of sports as well. And your role is an interesting one. So, head of commercial of British Fencing. Tell us a bit about what that involves.
Sure. Yeah, head of commercial for different sectors means different things. So it's a really good question. I've really coming into my 5th year at British Fencing, and there was no commercial department, so I was starting from scratch. And it was really appealing when I first started because it was very black and white. It was to come in, do a review of the services and products, and kind of engage all the people that we might do business with internally, getting people's perceptions on what we do, how we do it. And from there, it kind of started just within kind of the sports development side of British Fencing, and then it soon kind of grew. And when I kind of provided that that kind of report internally, it's kind of like, well, actually, some of these ideas might be a lot better for the whole organisation. And we're really battling with what's realistic and our ambition. So obviously, the ambition for lots would be, let's have millions and millions of pounds.
Absolutely.
That's not always that, and there's obviously things you can do to do that, and you can be very focused if that's what you want. But it was very clear from the chief executive, from the board, that actually we were looking at trying to create commercial partnerships and opportunities that were for the long term, and that was sustainable, and really trying to define what that means. And I think 4 or 5 years down the line, we can define that quite well now.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a lot of people, probably like me, they'll tune in and watch a bit of fencing in the Olympics, and I certainly sort of tune in and watch any sport that's on the Olympics when it's on. Yeah. Unfortunately, this year, and due to circumstances with the pandemic, and the Olympics isn't on, and but moving sort of forward with sort of fencing, tell us about the perception. I mean, the perception of fencing for me, it's the sort of sport that we sort of watch if the Olympics are on passively. But tell us a bit more about the sport itself, James. I mean, what are some of the barriers that you guys have got from a perception point of view?
Well, one of the biggest challenges that we have is financial. The actual work that we do and the outputs of the work that we do are really, really good. That's recognised with some of our stakeholders, and we've been fortunate to be able to secure funding from UK Sport and Sport England and elsewhere in recent years because of, one, how we run ourselves as an organisation from a governance perspective, but programmes like Muslim Girls Fence, which is a great project, utilising, kind of talking about social tolerance, using fencing as the catalyst for a conversation, but partnering with a charity called Maslahah. So again, we're kind of proving very early on from a sports perspective, if we don't know something very well, then we find that partner that is the specialist in that field and collaborate. So that's just one example of a project which I would definitely get people to kind of Google, called Muslim Girls Fence. And then we've established, I've established over the last recent years with the rest of the team, this kind of licensed partner program, and we've been able to, for the first time, understand our sphere of influence. So what that means is, in 2014, for instance, we had this report from Deloitte commissioned, and it said, kind of quite crudely, lots of sports have 3 buckets, as I talk about, Jimmy. One is community, so that participation. The other one in the middle is clubs, and then right at the end is high performance, or us as a national governing body. We're obviously responsible for the Olympic side as well, so we're a world-class program. But they're kind of the 3 main buckets, and fencing actually, the Deloitte report said it was around 100,000, but actually, as we've started building this licensed partner program that we've been able to establish, even just with one partner called PGL Travel. I don't know if you've heard of them, Jimmy. They do. Have you?
No, I haven't heard, to be fair. No. Yeah. No,
yeah. So you think kids activity holidays. So schools would kind of that kind of outdoor learning organisation. Yeah. They're one of the biggest in the UK, and they just them alone do just under last year they had just under 100,000 unique fencing participants. So we know that. So with all of our partners and in that community space, which is all about saw play and fun, there is whether it's that infamous sci-fi movie, Musketeers, Pirates, everybody's kind of picked up a stick in the woods and gone on guard, and that's kind of when people say it's niche. I always sometimes challenge that in the sense of depending on it really depends about what bucket you're talking about. If you're talking about sport and activity to engage kind of like people who are interested in sport, but then also those who aren't interested in sport, we call in sport inactives. And fencing is a great sport to offer as that gateway to loads of different kind of outcomes and conversations for people to change the way they're looking at themselves. So we've got this primary school resource pack right now with the intent to build resilience and looking at, we talk about self-efficacy, which is letting young people look at themselves in a different way. Or like, actually, I just did PE and I enjoyed it, and we were part of that journey for that young person, and that's actually really profound. So we do that from a community standpoint, which absolutely isn't about the upper middle class. Ironically, we don't actually have any direct delivery into independent schools or private schools. A lot of our projects are very much community based.
No, that's fantastic that getting in the community has a big impact, and I think you've made some really interesting points there, and I'm sure our listeners will, we can sort of speak at some point about getting involved, and that sort of just reminds me, actually, speaking to you there, James, I wouldn't say he's a colleague of mine, but more of a friend. He'd been on a course of mine, and he actually turned his attention to fencing after he suffered a disability. He won't mind me mentioning him, Adrian Derbyshire. He did a talk for me one time. It's actually on YouTube if people want to look it up. And I don't want to pretend to know how he had his disability, but he turned his attention to the Paralympics, and I believe he'd won 1 or 2 gold, and he's sort of going to schools speaking about winning gold and fencing. I think pretty sure he retired from fencing after 212 in London, Adrian Derbyshire. But I sort of mentioned that story because he sort of turned his attention to fencing because he used it as an outlet, quite loosely. Time permitting, he sort of talked about he used it as an outlet, how it helped him to sort of channel his attention to something that he could succeed. Now, from that point of view, going into the community, there must be people sort of who have got talent that if they could sort of get involved could go all the way and maybe not win gold, but be really competitive. I mean, what do you guys do? You talk about a performance plan. I'm not sure if it's sort of your remit, but you might know. What's the performance plan if, say, I was to take up fencing, for example? I probably wouldn't get too far, but is there a pathway for a person to sort of go all the way to gold if possible?
It's a really interesting question that you posed there, and it's not directly in my remit, but I kind of started off my career as a coach, so I was quite fascinated by the internal conversations I'm actually able to be part of. And it has changed. As I say, one of our biggest challenges is financial, but so previously we had a world-class program which was funded by UK Sport and Sport England, and we have had a grant a couple of years ago around supporting some of the athletes that we have medal opportunity with. So there's some support still there, but obviously not the investment that we had with a world class program. But we were able to pivot quite nicely into something that we call kind of an athlete development program. So we have a pathway for anybody to join at any stage and be able to plot out what they would need to do, whether we can be directly involved in the sense of delivery as we were in the world class program with psychologists and nutritionists, if that makes sense. That very much like under one roof. That's not possible currently because of the investment. But we absolutely do have the talent and motivation in the sense of kind of the fencers culturally within British fencing, what we have now as well. When you talk about medals, actually last year, and one to look out for is a guy called Marcus Mepstead. He's actually 15th in the world. He won silver last year at the World Championships in Hungary, and he's going to be definitely one to watch for. We internationally, the fencing competitions have if you look at the international website, the FIE, just kind of Google FIE fencing, you can come up with a fantastic website. It's really interactive website. You see a lot of TBDs, but it looks like the competitions and the qualifiers for Marcus is going to start in February next year. So that's going to be a really exciting one for us to obviously watch, hoping that he'll make it and find his way to Tokyo in 2021.
And do you sort of think that might be a medal prospect there, James, possibly in Tokyo, all things being well and the games going ahead next year?
Well, as soon as you get, that's one of the things why it works really well on the community level, and also, but one of the reasons why it's sometimes challenging at the elite ends when we talk about variability. It's quite rare when you can actually, it's kind of not, unlike tennis where you kind of like win, and it's like if you lose and it's quite a significant backstep. Kind of losing on your way to becoming world number one or gold medalist or any sort of medalist is, you're always going to have that. Hence why resilience is fencing is a great one to build resilience, because you have to learn how to lose in a humble way. It's going to be inevitable because of the variability. It's sometimes someone can just get a fluky hit on you. There's nothing you can do about it. But that's kind of the fun behind it as well. It's kind of the gamification of it, and that's quite attractive from our insight and our audience. The creatives, the gamers, the ones that like strategy are really quite interested around fencing, because you have to make decisions, and you talk about you might not be very good, but if you understand distance and timing, that you don't need to worry about all the other language, but distance and timing is absolutely key within fencing. So if you can understand that, then you're kind of half the way there.
And what about you mentioned the equipment there, James, is that sort of a barrier for someone to participate? I mean, I can imagine the equipment would obviously, you can buy a football or a tennis racket and, or a cricket bat, for example, but what's the equipment like in terms of financing the equipment to be a fencer?
It's from a club fencing equipment, you're talking £400 to £500. But again, it's when you can go onto our website, look at our activity finder at the top of our website, find a club, because the clubs, for the vast majority of the time, will be able to offer and lend and hire out equipment. So when you're going in for that kind of first have a go session or that beginner's course, you don't have to pay that kind of £400 or £500 up front. Just like and that's for brand new equipment. I've got many different bits of equipment that is definitely not brand new, but my golf set, for instance, is second hand. I can still go out and enjoy a game of golf.
Of course, absolutely. So it's like, I suppose, like you mentioned there, it's like anything, I guess, in one sense. You could buy a really expensive pair of football boots or an expensive racket as well. So there is opportunities for people who like to be able to access equipment. You're saying there, James, in terms of the
individually, and a lot of the work that we do now within schools and activity providers works around plastic equipment, which is significantly cheaper to deliver, and also foam swords. So our primary school resource pack program that I kind of mentioned before, doesn't use any metal equipment. So people often have that perception of fencing from an organisational standpoint. When offer it, they think Olympic fencing has to be metal, but in actual fact, that usually young person, just to take it for an example, their expectation, as I say, is musketeers. It's swordplay, it's fun, and that's what we've been able to. So we very much kind of encourage people to try and meet that participant at that point of smile, that point of intrigue. Instead of kind of saying, oh right, this is Olympic fencing straight away and there's 3 weapons. That will switch some people on, but it won't switch on the masses, which I think a lot of people, when they talk about what you're doing for the sport, grassroots, that's what they're kind of wanting to know about.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting stuff. I mean, that's sort of something sort of come to mind, James. I mean, I've interviewed people who participate in pentathlon before, and I've known a few pentathletes before, and there's almost a sense for me speaking to them, I suppose it's probably my perception that that obviously fencing is a key sport, or a key event within the pentathlon. Do you guys sort of get involved with other people who compete in modern pentathlon, or is it just completely separate altogether?
We definitely, it is separate. There's two different separate national governing bodies. Just like you mentioned earlier on the disability side, the Paralympic side of the sport. So that's a separate organisation. Although within our coach education, and our coaches are, there's parts of the course that touch upon people with disabilities. We're not the national governing body for the Paralympic sport of fencing. But yeah, with pentathlon, you currently still have to be a member of pentathlon and British fencing, and we come across them, and obviously they try to get pentathlon ready by entering some of our competitions as well. So yeah, it's certainly obviously one of those NGBs that we have a closer relationship with.
Yeah, because I mean the thing is, if you look at the success of the British Olympic team in the last, since 2012, and you could argue 2008. Even beyond that, obviously it's really moved forward, and I suppose, I mean, you mentioned, really interesting concept earlier on. The British public certainly loves their sport, definitely, and with funding available and opportunities available, I think that's been a big thing for success. But I think it's really important. You mentioned there about collaborating in some sense. Obviously, associations have their own remit, but I can sort of see fencing being a sport where you mentioned earlier about to be a good fencer, what it takes. I can see a transferable skill for a young person. If they take up fencing, it's just a transferable skill in terms of concentration, focus, and so on and so forth. And I mean, what do you guys do? You mentioned the community, but for like young people who want to get involved, and is there inroads for say a young person, maybe 10, 11 years of age who wants to get involved, and is there any opportunities for them to do that?
Opportunities to get involved we've got more than ever. Last week we've actually launched a free downloadable app.
Okay.
So you can go onto the store, iOS or Android store for phones and tablets. If you search for Explore Fencing, it's a free download. It has 2 access points. One is called Explore Fencing at the bottom of the screen. You can just dive straight into there, and you'll see 2 top GBR fencers called James and Kate, and they take you through some basic moves, as well as 2 games. And one of my favourites is Step Lunge, because it seems really simple. You're like, oh right, that's a simple game. But actually, if you kind of rewatch it the second or third time and actually listen to James, he explains the tactics. It's like, oh, actually, the penny's dropped about how this sport's really fun and how you can play around with it if you understand just a few of the basics. So yeah, that's one way. As I say, we've got an interactive activity finder where you can not just look for a club and then try to email them. You can, with a lot of our clubs now, they're putting data on there where you can find them and then book up as well straight away. Okay.
And that's on the app. Did you say, James, on the app? So on the app,
it actually has a link out to the activity finder on the app. But the app is searchable underneath Explore Fencing. So I'd encourage people to do that, and the games are purposely got no equipment. So again, it's one of the things we talk about is, and again, talking about why we maybe don't hear about fencing so much is we don't actually have any marketing department. There's other smaller sports actually have a marketing department, and again, it's a financial thing. What we have been able to do is, and we've got a fantastic person who's responsible for that called Sophie, who's our media and communications manager, but she's still part-time. Sorry, Jimmy, I lost my thread for a second.
No, it's getting involved. I mean, the app I think is useful, and certainly, the app there, I would encourage our listeners, if they're looking to get involved in fencing, or their children looking to get involved in fencing as well, to certainly download the app you've mentioned there, if that's the case, if that's possible for them to sort of know more. Just, I mean, obviously, off the sort of top of your head, no doubt this website will have more information, but are there sort of places in Manchester, James, that you know of yourself, or is there anywhere in and around Manchester area?
There's Manchester Fencing Centre, which is a great. Yes, the Manchester Fencing Centre is actually a performance centre, so we run actually quite a few athlete development camps out of there. So it's a beautiful facility that I'll definitely again try to. I don't know if I can maybe send you the links as well that you can maybe put alongside this, Jimmy.
Absolutely, that'd be great if you could send it through, and our listeners no doubt will be interested. I'm interested myself actually in terms of getting it out there. I think that's a great opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of sporting options over this way. I mean, we're actually in Salford, but we're not too far away from Manchester. There's a lot of sporting options here. The sporting tradition here is fantastic. But I'm all for transferable skills in sport, and you may not want to be a fencer, but certainly that sort of focus and dedication it takes to be in the moment is sort of phenomenal. Sort of that Zen approach, being in the moment. And the vision for you, James, what's the sort of vision in terms of, you've obviously worked there for a few years now and you've achieved a lot. Where do you sort of see things going now? What's your sort of collaborative vision with British fencing?
Well, the vision, I think, for a lot of sports and people in physical activity is around that more people, more active, more often. It's a statement that's kind of come out of one of the bodies out there called UK Active. So we're very much behind that vision. And what that really means for us from a sport that has, that Olympic association is more medals would be fantastic. As I said, we've got the talent and motivation to go ahead and kind of get those, but also more success across the disciplines of fencing as well. There's kind of three main Olympic fencing disciplines, so that's an absolute vision for us. But it really is being able to continue the projects and programs that we've been able to start up so far. And we've been fortunate last year. We've been in South Africa to impart because we've just launched
and more resources in terms of medaling at the Olympics. James, are there many variables that contribute towards the more sort of traditional nations who sort of tend to win more medals in the fencing?
Yeah, I mean, they just have that infrastructure, whether that's culturally, where they've taken themselves as a federation and the expectations of kind of like their blueprint to become. This is just a personal standpoint, by the way.
No, that's interesting to see your perspective.
So they've got the infrastructure, and then financially, it always has an impact. We're fortunate to be able to have the financial income to be able to provide that infrastructure, but no doubt we could do more, certainly with last year's success, if we were able to release some of the stresses on athletes, which are just inevitable, whether that's with a support team, whether that's being able to get to competitions, maybe those extra couple of days prior, so they can just acclimatise a bit better, so they can therefore perform better. All of those, so, and we're not talking vast sums of money. But that would be kind of an ideal, and obviously my role is very much about trying to look at some of those opportunities to support us being able to create a surplus to support our athletes and our what we call our core market, our membership. That otherwise we would when we get funding from elsewhere, too rightly, we have to make sure that we hit those objectives. Whether I have the opportunity to be able to create a commercial revenue stream which can support the things that we want to do and achieve as a national governing body for the sport, if that makes sense.
So it's a great point, and I suppose I was sort of reflecting when you were speaking there about British cycling and sort of the sort of resurgence, or the in terms of it takes one obviously it's not just one person winning a medal or gold medal. There's a lot more to it than that, but it goes to show how if you've got someone who does succeed, off the top of my head I think it was Boardman who sort of won gold at the Olympics, and then off the back of that you got interest, and you got obviously key people who get involved who put infrastructure together, and now obviously British cycling have dominated the world for a long time. So it's I'm sure a lot of hard work that goes with that, but it does go to show that if you've got the right people in place and infrastructure in place, then anything is possible in any sport, that's for sure. But
well, absolutely, and it's interesting when we talk about focal attention. I did my dissertation around the Sport and Giants campaign. I don't know if you remember that one, Jimmy.
Yes, indeed, absolutely, yeah. So
I was actually a sports scientist on that, and connected with some of the guys at the EIS. As a shout out to Ian Yates and Natalie Dunman, who supported me with my research. But it was just really interesting about that talent transfer model, and one of the successes, one of the precursors was multitude of different people. But there's a lady that again I met through my research, Chelsea Ward, who came over from Australia, and came over to the UK. As I'm sure you probably know her, working in the field, Jimmy. But she looked at that talent transfer model, and that target investment. Because you think about the Sydney Olympics, it's kind of like, well, why, with a couple 100,000 athletes, did they do so well, and we didn't with I think at the time it was a couple of million. Why?
Absolutely.
So that's again from being able to identify. My bit was from a psychology perspective. That's my real interest about the psychological determinants of what talent is, and trying to make the subjective objective. Which is alongside, which actually was, the Sport Giants was a very quantitative thing in the sense of, you've got two people who are X size, blue eyes, can jump, boom, boom, boom. But interestingly, they chose people or they just had a bit more. They demonstrated that their focal attention was a little bit better when they did this test, or they just grinded out the power test a little bit more than this other person. It was just interesting to see that. But I think, and we would love to be able to see that. As I say, what I haven't mentioned is that we've got an HE program as well. So lots of, we have a button with the Bucks, sport at universities with the Bucks competitions. So it's a great opportunity if anybody's out there thinking, well, I've just come to the end of, this sport, but fencing has always been intriguing, then definitely, go to your students' uni and see if we've got a relationship with you. Or we'd love to hear from you as well if you want to kind of have a direct message into British Fencing. We've got someone who looks after the higher education side of things called Ian, so that would be again another avenue, and each weapon as well has their specific. We've been able to kind of map out what would be applicable for each different weapon as well. So I think we're in a really exciting time where if anybody did have an interest where we could pick up that talent and take it through. One of the examples is with one of our partners, Premier Sport, who work in primary schools, identified, I think it was a year 5, year 6 student who's now in our athlete development program. So as a community sport coach, but they, through their training, understood that distance and time was really important, spotted it into this individual, and was being able to set her on a path, which we might be able to see, latter Olympics.
Absolutely, and actually made some really great points then. And like you said, I think in '96, obviously the Olympics, for GB as a team didn't go very well. But off the back of that, I think turned things around. And to think the last Olympics, the achievement was phenomenal in terms of finishing second. And I think London was always going to be hard to beat, but they went one step further. So maintaining that's not easy. That's for sure. I think these things go in cycles. But obviously, the more sports you've got, people involved, and sort of the more active people are, it has a knock-on effect, not just sports-wise and winning medals, but also socially. I think it's great to have people involved in different sports from a confident, motivated society as well. But it's been fascinating speaking to you, James. No doubt the listeners are interested. Is there like a website? You mentioned the app, but is there a website they can sort of go to, the listeners, if they're sort of interested to take things further? Yeah, so it's britishfencing.com. Fantastic. That's pretty easy enough. So britishfencing.com. So James, it's been a sort of pleasure having you on board. Great to speak to you. No doubt we'll speak again at some point. And certainly if you've got any sort of athletes, you're always welcome to come on board the show and to hear about how they're getting on. So thanks for coming on board the show, James. It's been great to hear more about what you do and fencing in Britain. Thank you very much, Jimmy. Appreciate it. Fantastic. That was James Craig, who's the head of commercial at British Fencing. Give us an insight into the world of fencing. Really fascinating insight into fencing. So get on that website if you're interested in getting involved. It's a great sport, a very transferable skill, and who knows how far you might go. The Friday Sports Show of Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you all the latest news around the local area and the world.